panelists to just sort of free flow. And we are live on YouTube now.
Okay, thank you everyone so much for joining us, especially Professor Gaines at this early in the morning.
Glad to be here.
Thank you again for attending our panel on education. My name is Yizhen Wu. I am a junior behavioral science psychology student at Duke Kunshan University and also the content designer for this panel. When I try to decide among different interesting topics regarding Sino-US relations, education in particular raised my interest due to its relevance to our contemporary societies and the inherent, possibly still, largely unsettled debate. In this panel, we will examine the challenges and opportunities faced by global education under the background of the global pandemic, heightened Sino-US political tension, and international educational reform. The discussion will focus on the implications of Zoom classes, visa restrictions for STEM scholars, academic freedom in higher education, and trends of Sino-US partnership in joint venture educational institutions. We hope this panel generates insights for better facilitation of global educational collaborations. It is thus with great honor for the DC-US team to introduce you to our moderator and speakers in this session. The moderator of our panel is Dr. Jason Gaines. Dr. Gaines is the Associate Dean of the Undergraduate Studies at DKU, where he manages a program that advises students on their post-graduation plans. He facilitates the academic integrity programming and processes, and he oversees the undergraduate scholarships. Dr. Gaines is also a comparative political behaviorist whose research focuses on the intersection of information technology and public opinion. He has published over 50 articles, 2 books, and he is the co-editor-chief of the Journal of Information Technology and Politics, the American Political Science Association's flagship journal in digital political communications. I'll pass it on to you, Dean Gaines, to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here, and I'm so thrilled to have the opportunity to moderate a panel of such illustrious scholars. As Zoe mentioned, we're going to cover a range of topics today, and hopefully everybody will find it informative and learn something. I am absolutely certain that I will learn something moving through this. So for the panelists, our expertise varies, and so it'll be nice. I think we'll get some different perspectives on the questions at hand. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists. I will start with Dr. Mary Brown Bullock, who is President Emerita of Agnes Scott College, an independent national liberal arts college for women. Before that, she was the first executive vice chancellor of DKU, and I am meeting her here, but we hear her name all of the time coming up in different things, so it's great to meet in person on Zoom. From 1988 to 1995, she presided as director of the Asia program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in DC. And simultaneously, she was a lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University. Before that, she was a director and a professional associate of the Committee on Scholarly Communication with the People's Republic of China. And before that, she earned her PhD in Chinese history at Stanford University. Next, Dr. Song Cao has a PhD in sociology from Columbia University and is a professor in innovation studies at the University of Nottingham in Ningbo. His research is focused on science, technology, and innovation in China from a social science perspective. including the scientific elite, human resources in science and technology, research, innovation, and entrepreneurship in nanotechnology and biotechnology, and the reform of the science and technology system. He's the author or co-author of 4 books, most recently GMO China, How Global Debates Transformed China's Agricultural Biotechnology Policies, and Innovation in China. Challenging the Global Science and Technology System. And he has published over 60 papers in well-known journals and edited volumes, and his research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, European Union's Framework Program, and the National Natural Science Foundation of China, among others. And last but not least, I will introduce my boss, Dr. Marcia France, who's the inaugural Dean of Undergraduate Studies and the Associate Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate Programs and the Language Culture Center at DKU. She oversees all undergraduate academic programs at DKU, including the highly distinctive Liberal Arts and Sciences undergraduate degree program, non-degree and summer undergraduate programs. She's responsible for the strategic development of undergraduate academic programs, developing and implementing undergraduate academic policies and procedures, undergraduate academic advising, undergraduate program assessment, and really relevant to today, global education. Before this, Dr. France was the John T. Herwick Professor of Chemistry at Washington and Lee University, where she also served as Associate Dean of the College and Associate Provost. She earned her SB in Chemistry from MIT, where she did, or is it BS? So, where she did undergraduate research under 2001 Nobel laureate in chemistry, K. Barry Sharpless. She received her master's in chemistry from Yale in 1990. She was a National Science Foundation predoctoral fellow at Caltech, where she earned her PhD in organic chemistry. And then her work on the development of, I don't even know how to say this, ruthenium catalysts for olefin metathesis was cited in the 2005 Nobel Prize address by her research mentor, Robert Grubbs. And so that's great. I can't even pronounce it. That's amazing. And so with that, I think we'll start the panel. I want to move forward here. And what we're going to do is we'll move through each of these topics. We'll start with the subtopic under global education challenges and opportunities with the benefits and challenges of bringing Chinese students to U.S. programs. And I want to start off with just a really simple question for the panelists that I think will have some interesting input is why is it a good idea for the U.S. to bring Chinese students to U.S. schools? And so as opposed to where, most of us here are coming from partnership universities in China, I'd like to know, why is it a good idea for U.S. schools to bring students to the U.S. from China? And I'll just open up from there.
Well, let me say, I'm Mary Bullock. I think Chinese students are smart. They bring money to the American schools, but also they contribute to American science in various fields that they come in. And so, although there are more than 300,000, I think, currently in the United States, these Chinese students make a real contribution to most of the programs.
Can I just add one more thing onto Mary just said? And one of the things actually I consider why the US is really need to bring this Chinese student to the US campus is that once these students finish their study in the US, basically this kind of international cross-border, this kind of international network has been established. If the student, some of the Chinese students return to their home country, meaning China, they are going to continue to maintain those relationships. They are going to be collaboration partners. They are going to bring their American mentors and their colleagues, their students back to China and try to help, try to develop the science, advanced science to the frontier of international research.
And I'll just also add that I think the mutual understanding that's gained is really an important component of international politics, everybody understanding each other. I mean, the intercultural communication, just trust between our countries is really key.
Yeah, and I think in addition, to build on Marcia's point, so much of the learning that happens for students on a college campus, it is intercultural exchange. And it's not just, I mean, for many students, like at my previous university, University of Louisville, a bunch of my students had come from rural areas and they had never even met somebody from another country, much less China. And having that sort of exposure in the classroom, I think contributes to their learning as much as oftentimes the what's happening in the class. And then the other point I wanted to add is the United States, arguably, and I don't think it's difficult to argue, has the premier higher education system in the world. Our high schools are not so great, but the college system and how they do that is by attracting the brightest talent from around the world. And obviously, as Dr. Bullock mentioned, there's a lot of bright talent coming out of China. And so, great. Why don't we move on to the next question, a little touchier question. Policy under the Trump administration and then continued under Biden has limited the opportunity for Chinese nationals to study in the US by excluding students who went to schools in China where scholars have worked on patents or technology that has military use. And reading some of the stories about this, basically students who may not have even worked on any of this technology are being excluded just because of the school they went to, which what I'd like to talk about is, do we even think that it's a good idea to have this policy in the first place, whether or not, and then also, if it is a good policy, are there some application problems, and could it be done a different way?
I don't think this is a good policy. Basically, this is something like guilty by association. I mean, basically, when you say that this national defense related university in China, you basically refer to these 7 universities which are associated with national defense industry. And many of the students actually attending this university do not necessarily major in, those kind of sensitive issues, right? They probably just do basic science, basic engineering, etc. They want to pursue advanced education in US and in other countries for the reasons we just discussed up front. So by excluding these students from going or attending the US university, basically it will be a loss for for the U.S. institution, as we just discussed. But on the other hand, there's a big kind of elephant in the room, which is called the China Initiative, which basically targeting high-end Chinese, ethnic Chinese talents working in the U.S. universities and research institutes, etc. Although the Biden administration already abolished this program, but the program probably does not exist in its name. But the essence of the program is still there. As the most recent case, the recent trial of a ethnic Chinese professor work at the University of Kentucky, Kansas, right? Frank Tao, is a case in point. I think maybe we really need to not only allow some of the Chinese students who are attending these universities entering into the U.S. for study, and also really have to pay more attention to this particular program actually has damaged very significantly the U.S.-China collaboration in education and in scientific research. It really has a chilling effect on ethnic Chinese academics working in the U.S. I just assume many of them probably have returned and will consider returning to China in the coming years. That will be a very significant impact on the U.S. scientific research enterprises in a negative way. Thank you.
Yeah, I would add that to me, it's just another version of racial profiling. It's national profiling, and we're wrapping innocent students up with anything else that might, there might be legitimate concerns in there, but we're not taking the time to figure out where those actual concerns are. That's this blanket policy that ends up affecting many people who really shouldn't be brought into that. And I think, if you look at the US and how many schools might have funding by the Department of Defense, if a school in China were to say, we're not going to accept any university where where they had grant money from DOD, we're not going to accept any undergraduate students for graduate programs, that would be ridiculous and we'd all be up in arms. So I think we have to be really careful about separating the broader population of all Chinese students from certain schools from people who might actually have done something wrong.
I think the comments so far have been very good. I think there is a very real chilling effect. But I think in the material that you sent us, Jason, it shows that this has really gotten a lot of publicity. Only 1 or 2% of the Chinese who have applied to come to America have been turned down. So 1 to 2% is very, very small, especially if we compare with Americans going to China.
Yeah, absolutely. I noticed that too. It's only 1 to 2%. It was interesting though, someone studied and sort of calculated the long-term effect of that 1 to 2% in some different ways, and that was interesting how they suggested that even though it's a small percentage, the impact is not negligible. Right. And for me, like, some of this stuff is just principle. I on the other day, my 16-year-old daughter heard an advertisement on television that was a CNN advertisement, and the pitch was, why can't we go back to when there was a common enemy? And the pitch was talking about sort of partisan struggles in the US between the Democrats and the Republicans. And it was like, and the suggestion was that we in the US should have some common enemy. And my daughter said, well, why? Like, why do we need, that's a good thing for us to come together over a common enemy? If that's the problem in the first place. And so then you're just moving that problem elsewhere. And I think about things like this, like it's this type of policy that creates that. And then the reason that probably this gets so much publicity too is because that us versus them mentality is out there. Journalists are pushing it, and it makes a nice frame for them. And the thing is the buildup of all of these types of policies create this mentality that then people are supportive of this. And to Marcia's point, if China did the same thing, I wouldn't be the associate dean at DKU because I've been on a Department of Defense grant. And so it's really, I just think, I mean, maybe I'm an idealist, but I think that there's such a better way to think about why and how we have these exchanges. And global education is one of the best ways for us to build bridges. I hope we didn't lose Song. Sometimes he's in Shanghai for the panelists, and sometimes the internet is a little shoddy in places. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. For STEM programs and other sensitive subjects related to science and technology, how can the two nations resolve the tension between open academic collaboration and preservation of confidential knowledge? And while there's been a lot of incidents of people secretly pulling into salaries, committing industrial espionage, hacking computers, scrutinizing, banning innocent students and researchers maybe get caught in the crossfire of some of these things. And so, I mean, sort of as Marcia acknowledged earlier, there may be real problems that we have to deal with, but these sort of catch-all type programs may stymie some of the really useful collaboration that we've talked about so far. So I'm curious, like, just thoughts on, are there better ways to think about preserving academic collaboration while also building in protections? And this is a tough question, but, and I was hoping Song here because it was here. Go ahead.
Certainly. Jason, all of your questions are tough questions. This is a difficult moment between the two countries, and science and technology are critical. I would say again and again that transparency is important. That's my mantra in a way. There should be no dual salaries. There should be no surprises about what is your home institution at all. And so I think that is something we need to recognize to be important in the future. And I think that the universities, especially American universities, should play an important role. And I think they have recognized this in the last 5 years or so, that they control, in a way, if there is any control, it should come from the university, not from the government, about who should come and who shouldn't come. And I think if American universities play their role, and they increasingly are doing so, this is the right way. I do think that students will be caught up in this. That is inevitable, and maybe it's too bad for the future, but this is the moment that we live in.
Yeah, I would second that. I think, it's really important that the agreements be made in advance, that everybody understands and is transparent about what everybody's getting into, the salaries, intellectual property rights, and there should be some level of comfort that people can disclose these potential connections without fear of reprisals, which will encourage the openness. And I fully agree that negotiation on the university level and making sure that, someone's home university and the new university that they're working with are both on the same page and in agreement on, even I would also add to that academic freedom arrangements, ideas of what you can publish. All of those, I think, have to be discussed in advance.
I just want to add one more thing, which is actually has been discussed in the GSN report about the national security issue and the fundamental research. And one of the issues actually that this particular report that mentions is something called a conflict of commitment. That's on top of usually what we talk about, the conflict of interest. So we are very much familiar with that particular issue of conflict of interest. But this conflict of commitments is something very new. So it really raised the issue of everyone actually involved in international collaboration between the US institution and another institution. Does not necessarily mean a Chinese institution. So this kind of commitment to a particular institution, to a particular employee, so is an important issue to deal with. I think the second issue is an older issue, is kind of dual use technology, those kind of deemed export control kind of issues in scientific research. I think that issue probably in the coming years will get a more kind of attention in the research community, not necessarily by the U.S. government, but also maybe in the research community as a whole. So these are the two issues probably we need to pay some attention in the collaboration between an U.S. institution and an institution from outside the country.
Great. Along the same topic, next question is, what are some specific challenges and dilemmas faced by professors and PhD students who need financial support and collaboration from both countries and whose research topics are regarded as sensitive? How can individuals deal with such restrictions and minimize the harm to their research? And I think this probably happens both ways, like students in China doing research from the US and vice versa. But I think this is probably particularly true for Chinese students trying to come and do research in the US. And I think probably with STEM and social sciences as well. I think like trying to figure out how to manage this is difficult. Like I think students bringing in, for me, so much of what works, especially in the social sciences, what makes for great research is critical thinking, and for critical thought to be useful, you have to be able to have free thought, where you're able to weigh and critique and measure things from all perspectives. That said, like someone trying to do that kind of research that could put them in a position, I think the steps to take beforehand is just to be know what you're getting into, right? Is you have to know what you're doing and talk with people about it and be certain about like what Marcia mentioned, for people coming to China to know what topics are off limits, know what topics are going to sort of rock the boat, and then wade into that carefully, which is unfortunate, really, because I think that it deters it deters from the sort of it may actually stymie students from being the best researchers that they can, because they're sort of limited. It's almost like ignoring data and ignoring entire sets of data to answer questions. So I think I am going to go ahead and move on to the next topic, which is the short and long-term implications of remote education for U.S.-China educational partnerships. Zoom school. Okay, so COVID has clearly changed the way we deliver education. And this is certainly true for the China-US case because of travel restrictions, right? And it's impacted education for international students not being able to come back in. And so, so many students, and this is true in US schools where, students basically missed an entire year or more of the college experience. And this is happening for our international students at DKU. Now, moving to this new online remote learning model and/or hybrid model may create opportunities for diversifying student bodies by making it possible to get students from around the globe and create all sorts of connection. On the other hand, it doesn't. I really don't believe that it replicates the type of exchange and benefit that we were talking about earlier that you get from the intercultural communication in and outside the classroom, that they can benefit. And that intercultural communication, I think, is really a part of the in-person learning model. So I'd like to know, like, where do you all come down on this, on whether the sort of new remote learning model is a good thing, bad thing? What are the good things? What are the bad things? It's a model that we don't really have a lot of choice in, and so that's certain. But let's talk a little bit about good and bad things about it for global learning.
Yeah, well, I think we've certainly learned at DKU that education through Zoom or hybrid is not the same as having everybody together in a classroom in one place. We're dealing with everything from internet challenges. We lost Song a few minutes ago. That happens when students are in class. We're dealing with time zone differences. It's 4 something in the morning for you, I guess 5:30 in the morning for you now, Jason, that, people are not able to really all participate in a live and a fair, equitable manner. And you lose even the different perspectives that you might have in the conversations in the classroom if people aren't able to join in live. You lose also things like the hands-on experience in the lab. And university is about so much more than what's happening in the classroom. And if people are only logging in to come to class, then they're losing out on the co-curricular activities, the learning Chinese or English side by side with native speakers, the relationship building that forms that community. In general, I think students learn as much from their peers as they do from their faculty, but they're missing out on all of those kinds of interactions. So, I'll leave room for other people. I could, go on longer on this, but, I really do think it's been very clear to all of us that while there may be some advantages, there's also a lot of disadvantages, and it's just not the same.
I totally agree with Marshall. Basically, the other two things, I think one is kind of group work, right? Teamwork, group work. So that's very difficult. It's very difficult for students, living in different kind of time zone, different countries. The other thing is, one of the important, college experience is sports. When you cannot play sports at the same place, it will make this kind of intercommunication and exchange very, very difficult, even impossible. So I think these are the two big issues, at least from my perspective. So we really need to, to end those sort of things as soon as possible. So it's been 2 years. Basically, students have lost this kind of content for 2 years, not just 2 months, right? It's unbelievable.
I agree with everything that was said.
It's really, go ahead, Mary, did you have something else?
Well, I was going to say that the Schwartzman program worked very, very, very hard to get international students to Beijing. I think that is worth it in a way, but most places can't do that kind of hands-on attention to international travel to China. We have not really, Jason, talked about the barriers that China has set up and whether these will begin to go away in 2023. And I think that it's almost impossible to go to China now, both because of the visa restrictions, which occurred before COVID, and the transparent problems of the COVID era.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think this is a very difficult issue for people like all of the rest of you to have to deal with.
Absolutely.
One of the issue we haven't talked about, we basically have talked about a student kind of study learning experience, but on the other hand, the visa restriction, not for faculty, not necessarily for faculty, for international faculty members, but for their children and for their spouse, and has made it. The job for international faculty members working in China very, very difficult. In the last couple of months, actually, I've seen 5 international faculty members actually say that they're going to leave just for the reason for their family members cannot join them. So, under those circumstances, we are not international university. We are not joining venture anymore. So we just, similar to the Chinese university, that really doesn't make any sense for us to have those kind of institutions in China. So.
Yeah, well, there's also, whether for faculty, whether they're Chinese or international, they're cut off from going to international conferences. And if they try to attend online, for the few that even still exist online, the time zone issue again, people who have international collaborations, people who do field work anywhere outside of China, that it really is hurting China's own researchers as well as international. And so, those travel restrictions are a huge issue on so many levels.
Yeah, it really creates a lot of problems. I think part of the point of these joint venture universities, and Song mentioned this, is what separates them from a Chinese university is an international faculty. Which is what U.S. institutions have. U.S. institutions have faculty from all over the world, and this is what creates that entire environment in and outside the classroom that makes for learning. And I think if the China really needs to try to work this out, if it is indeed a goal. They've got to sort that out. This pulls us to our last topic: future of educational partnerships between China and the U.S. Partnerships between U.S. universities and China have grown over the last couple decades, and we've talked about a lot of the benefits, and we've talked about whether these things are good or bad, and so. I think the panelists, we can all agree that these partnerships are a good thing for science. They're a good thing for education. It's just it's a positive thing. But we've also talked about a lot of challenges and hurdles. And one of those challenges is the protection of academic freedom in joint venture universities. And so what I'd like to know is what can these joint venture universities like DKU do? I mean, we've got tons of these other partnership universities. What can be done to protect academic freedom while still sort of balancing the ideological and cultural differences between the two nations?
Well, let me say that certainly for DKU, the academic freedom issue occurred very early on. It always was there. And so the Duke faculty were always concerned that China would not allow academic freedom. And I remember being asked every time I went to Durham about academic freedom. Certainly, I'm sure that Marcia, if you go back, if you have a chance to go back, you'll be asked about this. I think that the question is what is happening today? And is there space, some small amount of space, for a non-Chinese, a joint venture university continue during this period? If there is a small space, it should be preserved. And I think that Marcia and Professor Tsung and Jason, all of you can talk about how to preserve it. But I think that the joint venture university, joint venture is different than all the collaborations that Jason, you refer to. Joint venture means that the undergraduate degree is certified also, in your sense, by Nottingham, by Duke. And so it's an undergraduate approval. And that is very tricky and very hard to maintain. So anyway, that is by preamble.
Yeah, I think that it's one of those areas that probably needs constant conversations and reaffirmation, that over time, you know, as people come and go and change within each institution, we have to make sure that we're continuing to have these conversations and reestablishing between all of the partners where our commitment to academic freedom is, where our responsibilities to academic freedom, you know, lie, and how we navigate some of those tricky in between type of areas in some way that can be mutually acceptable to both sides.
Yeah, I agree with that, and really believe that what's critical is that that in this open communication between the Chinese interests and those interests from these partnership universities, is that all of the do's and don'ts are explicated very clearly. So that everybody knows what are the boundaries of academic freedom. Because let's be honest, like even in the United States, there are boundaries, and there are things where lines can be crossed, and so what's really important is that faculty, students, those in the Chinese government that are interested in this all know exactly what everybody has agreed on, where those lines are, and that's difficult, and that's not necessarily static, and so that's why Marcia's point is very clear. These things move around, but.
Well, one thing I learned by years in China was that academic freedom means something very different in China than in America. And so academic freedom at that time often meant to be free of the state, to have a little more control over your curriculum. But it's very different from American views of academic freedom. So your comment, Jason, I think is good, but I think we have to be very clear what we're talking about.
I think the debate or discussion on academic freedom issue actually has some sort of operational kind of implications. For example, I mean, if we want to use a particular, book or books in our teaching, so usually we have to ask the libraries to order this kind of book or order the e-copies. And those kind of COVID situation, we want to have this kind of e-copies available at the university, at the library. But the university library will say, okay, we can submit the request to the book import and export companies, but they will say, we want to support those, use this kind of book, but the book import and export companies say, oh, these kind of books are not allowed to be imported into China. So there are some sort of different levels of understanding of what kind of joint venture and the curriculum development and what kind of material we're going to use in our teaching. So, and at the university level, or maybe at the libraries level, and also at the book export and import companies. So those sort of things actually is very kind of tricky and have some sort of implications for our operation, for our teaching, very, very significantly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know at DKU, we have those issues as well. They come up, and I think where how we sort of manage other types of academic integrity issues, and some of the agreements can come not about just specific book or specific topic, but more about the procedure. Like our topics that are going to be discussed only within the confines of the university, or are there invites for people outside the university? Are these going to be on YouTube discussions? A whole range of things that can come up with how you address different topics. I'm going to ask, we have a ton of questions coming in from students, but what I would like to do is just ask one final question for everybody before getting to those, which is a broad question, and I'd like to hear what everybody thinks, even if it's brief here, is what's the future of educational partnerships between China and the US?
I think probably we will have a period of difficulty, but in the long run, I think there will be bright future, because from China's perspective, we really need the help from the US university and the US scientific enterprise. If we look back in the last 40 years, any kind of advance in science technology in China has basically benefited from China being part of globalization, especially by working with scientists in the US and other developed countries. I think the US scientists and US universities have given the Chinese counterparts the biggest help, and China has learned a great deal from working with US universities and US scientists. So in the long run, I think those sort of relationships will be sustained. So despite we are having those kind of short period of difficulty right now.
Yeah, I think, I definitely see that even in the 4 years I've been at DKU, it's become more challenging. But I just truly hope that we can overcome the differences and survive. Because to me, if nothing else, the last few years have really demonstrated how incredibly important our mission is. You know, the mutual respect, the collaboration, the working together to solve global challenges, not just between China and the US, but globally, we can see how important the intercultural communication is, the mutual understanding to, you know, our entire world. And so, you know, I think that we're needed now more than ever.
The only thing I would add, I agree with what has been said. We have to realize that the Chinese system is changing and the American system is changing. So as we look out, I think future partnerships may look different, and we should recognize that.
Right. I think we can get to some of the questions that have come in. I'll start with the first one here is, U.S. discourse about China tends to assume Western definitions of ideas like democracy. There seems to be a widening gap of understanding between Western and other views of democracy, namely liberal democracy, compared to what China likes to call process people's democracy. Do you think this shortfall of understanding is asymmetrical? Do you see potential for U.S. higher education to bridge this gap in this discourse? This is a huge question, and do I think that the U.S. higher education can bridge this gap? Not immediately, no. And the problem is, I mean, what you're really getting at is a very sort of postmodern sort of question. Like, and the American public is not very postmodern. And so when you're asking Americans to reconceptualize what they think they invented, and which they didn't. They did not invent democracy, and having this sort of wider view of what it can be, and the shortcomings of the American system, and the pros of the Chinese views of this. They can, and look, for me as a scholar of started out of U.S. politics and then broadened to become more of a comparative. I do public opinion studies in multiple countries, including China. I've done survey work in China, and I think that we have a long way to go before people are willing to hear these ideas. And so then even in the US institution, if you have professors who are talking about that we have a limited view of democracy in the US, and maybe there's this whole process democracy, only certain students are going to get that. And then some students would just write that off as liberal professor nonsense. And because they're socialized into a whole set of different ideas that they bring to the table when they come in. But look, like, to tie this back to the panel, everything we were talking about up front about intercultural communication, if we're ever going to bridge this gap, these kinds of partnership universities, continuing the U.S. not putting limits on bringing in international students, including Chinese students, is a step in the right direction. But this is just a big hurdle. Next question: how can joint venture universities, especially those in China, ensure, well, I mean, we've sort of talked to this, ensure academic freedom, without giving increasing Chinese government censorship. I think we covered that. What could students and faculty in Chinese U.S. institutions do to help improve the bilateral relationship? Like, so what could students and faculty do to help in this sort of, to improve the overall relationship? I'll start with a simple answer. Hold forums like this.
I'll add that in the long term, our current students are the next generation of leaders. And if we're generating people who are going to go on to careers in all kinds of different fields, who are going to be leaders, who understand the US-China relationships and the people, that's going to be a huge start. Obviously, we've got a ways before our current students are in those positions. So there's things that, we want to think about how we start now, but I do think it starts at the individual people level and that mutual understanding.
You're muted, Song.
All right. I think the business community, over the last 30, 40 years have played a very significant role in strengthening the relationship between the countries. I think maybe the educational community maybe can do the same. I try to form some sort of strong force, try to lobby the government of both sides, try to help the strengthening of the relationship between these two countries. I think from Chinese government's perspective, it allows like DKU and NYU Shanghai, those sort of joint ventures to be existing in China. Basically, it shows that they see the values of the international education. So, right, in the coming years, probably we'll see more those kind of establishments to be approved by the Chinese government. If that's the case, I think that these joint ventures, along with other universities in China and the US, will play the more important roles.
I think what students and faculty can do is continue to promote exchange. Like some of these, so much of like what I know or think I know and understand about political differences, about cultural differences, about all of these things have come from me seeing and having exposure to people with different backgrounds than myself, and continuing to do that. Look, I'm an optimist. I try to be, and I think about, I grew up Cold War era, where, I think as a kid, I remember like it was just where I am now to what I think about people who are different from me is just worlds apart from where I was when I was a kid. And so much of that has come from all of these exchanges and a sort of a willingness to accept ideas that are different from mine, and I feel like I just hope we can continue to do this, because I think what most Americans, I think, fail to recognize, which back to the first question we had, where I do think some of these bridging the gap is somewhat asymmetrical. I feel like for the most part, most Chinese students seem to, and faculty seem, and just people seem to recognize what a lot of the things that the US has to offer in ways to think about things and science and all kinds of different things. And I'm not so sure that that's true the other way. I'm not so sure that a lot of Americans really necessarily recognize what China has to offer. And I feel like that we as faculty and as students who are all part of some kind of exchange can continue to promote that sort of flow, so that ultimately maybe 50 years down the road, the differences that we see now, maybe like what ultimately has to happen for this really to move is, I think, US politicians need to not have the incentive to promote division, right? And so sort of now they're incentivized to promote this common enemy that I've talked about before. And then in doing so, it makes it difficult for us to get the real benefit of the understanding and exchange that we can get and learn from each other. So that brings us to the end of the panel. I'm sure there were people out there who had more questions. I really enjoyed this talk. It was, I didn't know how much I would enjoy it at 5 o'clock in the morning in Los Angeles, but amazingly enough, I enjoyed it. And now I may go to Disneyland. So thank you everyone for participating, and thank you for the organizers. This was really helpful.
Thank you, Jason.
And I'll let you close, Zoe.
Yeah, thank you so much for our speakers for joining us today. This is the end of the education panel and the last panel of the DCUS 2022 Summit. And we thank you all for participating. So good evening, good morning, good night.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Okay.
you.
See you later.